We got the nature boy Ric Flair with us today. You can go, I think you start out. Print you this one.
I command you.
Everything's on?
Okay. Yeah.
Good morning. I'm Representative Prince Chestnut. I want to thank you all for joining us for this special press conference regarding the Alabama Supreme Court ruling on IVF or in vitro fertilization. I think we should begin by discussing the court ruling that has brought the issue to the forefront and the unintended consequences that it may impose on Alabama women and families. The ruling stated that the frozen embryos used in fertility treatments are unborn children and have the same legal rights as living, breathing children, even if they are being stored indefinitely outside the mother's uterus. For those unfamiliar with IVF, the process works like this. An egg is removed from the woman's ovaries and fertilized with sperm in a laboratory. The fertilized egg, called an embryo, is then returned to the woman's womb to grow and develop. Typically, several embryos are used in the process to create one successful pregnancy, and the embryos are screened to avoid genetic defects or abnormalities. Without getting too technical, the scientific term in vitro is used to refer to any biological procedure that is performed outside the organism, like here in a lab. An in vivo procedure, alternatively, is where the tissue remains inside the living organism in which it is normally found. The point here is that an embryo cannot develop into a child until it is implanted into a woman's uterus. Also, an embryo can be frozen and stored, unlike a living human. That's why there's so much alarm over the Alabama Supreme Court's ruling and its impact on women, their families, and IVF healthcare providers. To put this in perspective, in 2018, it was estimated that 8 million children had been born worldwide using IVF and other assisted reproduction techniques. Children that were born to women facing fertility complications that wouldn't have been able to give birth without these treatments. Due to this ruling, many fertility clinics in Alabama have now paused operations. This has disrupted the lives of women and hopeful parents who use these treatments to start or expand their families. That's why I'm proud to co-sponsor Leader Daniels' bill HB225, which would provide that any fertilized human egg or human embryo that exists outside of a human uterus is not considered an unborn child or a human being for any purpose under state law. To explain more about the urgency and the importance of this bill, I would like to introduce the bill's sponsor, Alabama House Minority Leader Anthony Daniels.
Thank you, Representative Chestnut, and certainly thank you for being a co-sponsor of this very important piece of legislation. Let me begin by saying that I'm proud of HB 225, in which immediately put a halt on the Alabama Supreme Court decision ruling that happened a couple weeks ago. Sadly, the court ruling that frozen embryos stored in a laboratory freezer are children. It's harmful to those hoping to build families, especially those using IVF. You know, I heard from a family over the weekend, on Friday actually. The first family that reached out to me that we were able to talk, and they talked about, we're in our 40s. We recently married and we're in our 40s. And we finally have a viable embryo. And our appointment is on March 11th. But we received a call that our appointment has been postponed. Other families that This is their 8th time using this treatment as the only option that they have available to them and their families, have been denied and said that their appointment is also been postponed. And so this is a very important issue that we have to deal with, and unfortunately, we have to deal with this particular issue legislatively. So several clinics have had to pause their treatments due to the confusion and uncertainty surrounding this ruling. As a result, women and families have been left in limbo. This bill, House Bill 225, is very simple and clear in what it does and what it accomplishes. It would clearly define that an embryo, fertilized or not, outside of the uterus is not considered any form of personhood. The scientific fact is that the reason you can freeze an embryo is because it's not alive. Science also explains why we can't freeze a living human being and simply thaw them out later. It's not just science, it's common sense. These can be complicated issues. That's why this bill will not attempt to dictate where life begins or ends. Rather, it will clarify the law, a fundamental fact that a fertilized embryo outside of the human uterus is certainly not any form of person under law. This is consistent with science and the importance of maternal and infant health care for women of Alabama. That's why I consistently oppose draconian abortion bans that makes no exception for rape and incest. Since that ban was passed, I've introduced legislation to remove to protect rape and incest. I also did this on the House floor in 2019 when we were debating this law, where my colleagues across the aisle felt that this particular law would never make it to the Supreme Court. Roe v. Wade would never be overturned. And we warned them with the individuals that were confirmed to the court and looking at their position in previous writings and the things that they've talked about publicly, that there's absolute opposite of what's going to happen. And so we warned them about this. And so, however, I strongly believe that the abortion ban should be struck down altogether, and that women should have the right to make decisions about their own personal reproductive rights. Again, that's why it's so important that we pass HB 225 as quickly as possible, because the court's decision has already imposed negative and unintended consequences for women with fertility issues who are simply trying to have children. It also jeopardizes the healthcare providers, and many have to stop providing services. And so for many women, IVF fertility treatment are their only practical option, and the court's ruling will effectively take that choice away from them. Like I said previously, there are so many questions surrounding the issue still have not been addressed. HB 225 focused solely on allowing women to continue using fertility services without fear of criminal or civil liability for themselves or for the healthcare provider. So I urge you to support this legislation because it will bring clarity and stability to the law of IVF fertility treatment. Most importantly, this will also return the personal medical decisions back to the women and their doctors, instead of politicians who have absolute no business making a decision about a person's rights. At the end of the day, we must advocate for empowering women and include fighting for women's reproductive care and reproductive freedom. And so this issue is an issue that is not a new issue. Every year in the Alabama legislature, they've been trying to chip away at this issue for over and over again, taking away the rights of women and families. And it has to stop. And women and husbands and fathers and sons and daughters, everybody in the state of Alabama, we have to stand united. We have to stand united not just on this decision, but also the decision and mistakes that we've already made. Understand that we would like to go farther on this particular issue, even as far as in a constitutional amendment. But right now, we have to deal with what's in front of us. When a family calls you and tell you that they are having an appointment to be able to produce life on March 11th, that's not long, that's a couple of weeks from now. When they tell you that they're tough, they're having to make tough decisions and they're emotional distress. The family, what they're going through right now, emotionally, I can't even imagine. And so for me and for the state of Alabama, we have to act immediately and put politics to the side and address this issue once and for all, restoring the rights and the decisions back to women and their doctors, not politicians. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce my colleague, the gentlewoman from Macon County and staunch advocate for women's rights in this state, Ms. Pamela Warren.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Leader Daniels. As we look at the court's ruling and the purpose behind House Bill 225, I think it's important to discuss this issue in a broader context. Alabama is facing a number of growing issues relating to reproductive, maternal, and infant health care. Reports show that we have the highest rate of mothers dying from pregnancy-related issues in the country. Our overall maternal mortality rate is 64.63%, deaths per 100,000 births, nearly double the national rate. For Black women in Alabama, it's even higher. Meanwhile, more than a third of our counties are now maternity care deserts, meaning they have no hospital with obstetric care, birth centers, OB/GYNs, or certified nurse midwives. And nearly 28% of women in Alabama have no birthing hospitals within 30 minutes. For some rural areas, it's even farther. And as a woman, I've had that experience because I live in a county where there's no hospital, no OB/GYN, and what the situation is. All I can say is thank God I'm too old now, okay? Coupled with efforts to erode reproductive freedom, our failure to expand Medicaid, address the shortage of doctors, nurses, and healthcare workers, and support rural hospitals is taking a devastating toll. The reality is reproductive health and maternity health are deeply connected, and that these issues require our immediate attention. Like Leader Daniels mentioned in his remarks, this bill is narrowly focused to address the consequences of the Alabama Supreme Court ruling. However, we must also not lose our focus on improving access to affordable and quality health care for Alabama's women and children. For too long, they have been left behind, and hopefully this controversy surrounding IVF will bring these other important women health care issues back into our public discourse. Thank you so much for your time and support as we work to pass House Bill 225 for Alabama women and their families. We will be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Oh, yes, Maddie and then Aaron.
The Attorney General has said he will not prosecute families or providers. Would you call on IVF clinics to reopen under that statement at this point?
I wouldn't. I think anything short of the legislation that we've introduced can, the Attorney General, I hear the Attorney General's, I guess his chief counsel mentioned this. We have not actually heard from the Attorney General himself. And so I would want to see something in writing. If it could be reduced to writing, I certainly want to see something in writing. The other thing is, what about a DA? Have all the DAs come out in all the 67 counties and said they would not try to prosecute under this particular statute, under the Supreme Court decision? And so I think that sometimes we hear comments, but the law right now, because these IVF clinics have chosen to pause all of their treatment, that tells us that there are some great concerns because they're not operating their businesses. And so I think that the other thing is the mere fact that appointments have been postponed. That's another issue. That's another concern. There's a fear of prosecution, criminal prosecution. And so I think that we can't depend upon the word of individual when it can be reduced to writing. If it's reduced in writing, then let's have a deeper conversation. But there are other nuances, things that could possibly happen that does not meet the eye. But anything short of this legislation being enacted. Now, we pull the language for this piece of legislation directly from the Supreme Court's decision, from this case. And so the language is identical in its statute. I know that there are some that want to see more of a constitutional amendment, but let's think about it. Families right now can't wait to November to have a decision made. And who's to say that the Alabama legislature is going to take in a constitutional amendment to actually address the issue from a constitutional standpoint? And so let's make certain that we separate those issues, because this bill helps people right now, immediately. And if upon the passage of this bill and the signage by the governor, it takes place immediately. And so you're talking, this can be taken care of in a week and a half. It can be solved. And so I would urge our citizens out there to call your representatives, to call your senators, to call the governor's office and ask them to support HB225. Yeah.
Talking about the speed of the legislation, what do you expect that will be? Will we see it in committee on the floor this week?
I'm hopeful. You know, the Senate has different rules than the House. The Senate can move legislation a lot faster than the House of Representatives. But I'm very hopeful that in the House of Representatives, even if we have to use the Senate bill, then if the Senate bill comes down and we're in a 3-day work week, there's a possibility that we can get to this legislation on Thursday. And then I'll get you.
Mr. Chestnut described the IVF process using the term organisms to describe people that are going through IVF and the embryos being implanted to them. And I just want to know how the Alabama State House plans to talk about personhood and life and who deserves to be called that when we call women and the people who are going through IVF organisms.
So that's why this legislation is important. It's a separate issue. We're describing personhood as not being an embryo that's a fertilized embryo that's in a lab. We're not considering that personhood. That's what this bill actually does. Now, have the legislature, when you start getting to that debate, then you start pulling more organizations into the fold, and the likelihood of getting something done is less likely.
I'm just not an organism.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'm not an organism.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
You talked about not wanting to wait for CA, but do you think that statutorily is enough to fix this, considering that the justices heavily relied on that CA language in 2018? And do you think people had a good idea of the possible ramifications of that CA when it was approved in 2018?
So I really believe that the statute, from a statutory standpoint, it would immediately take an effect, and it will be able to continue the services that are already out there. From a long-term fix in stable and being stable long-term, I do think that we should consider a constitutional amendment. But for those families right now that are going through that treatment, they can't wait until November to a constitutional amendment pass or fail, and so they can't bet on those odds are not good for them. And so I think that from a statutory standpoint, if we address the issue right now with this legislation, it'll get us to the point. And I think that IVF clinics will feel more comfortable operating than not.
Have they told you that? Have you had any conversations?
I've had some conversation privately with them because they don't want to be on the radar of fear of retaliation by certain groups. And so, yes, I've had some conversations. Yes.
It's going to segue into my question. Have you had a chance or have you heard from any other members of the House chamber about what their feelings are about this, what their thoughts are about this? Take the temperature of the room, as they say.
There have been some that have come forward and said that they actually have gone through this process before. and they talked about the need to have something done immediately. There was conversations, casual conversations about this particular issue early on, but I will tell you that right now the conversation is when they're hearing from their constituents, members of the legislature that on both sides of the aisle actually have friends and family members that have gone and children that have gone through this particular process. So it's it's becoming it's a personal issue to a lot of them. And you're right, the young lady that spoken earlier, you're not an organism. And so that's not something that, I would just say you're not. And so I apologize if anyone mentioned that. I didn't hear it, but I apologize if anyone mentioned that. So, yes, ma'am.
So we know that Senator Melton also introduced a bill that was similar to yours. What are the differences there, and why not work on a companion bill?
So Senator Melton hasn't actually dropped the bill. He's talked about a draft bill. So I don't know what's in his bill. I'm told that his bill may address some of the, may create a separate category for potential life. My bill doesn't create a category for potential life. And so it can't be a companion if there's certainly stark differences there. I'm ready to address the issue immediately so that we can continue that, because creating a separate category could also lead to other potential issues that we've not seen, and our staff is evaluating the comments that was made by him regarding potential life. And so that's something that's something that there's a lot of uncertainty around. It doesn't actually solve the problem.
So, sir, even though you said that sometimes Senate does move at lightning speed, your bill is ready to go.
Yes.
And it could be on the House floor possibly this week.
It could be, and it could be out by Thursday. If we're on a 3-day work week, it can be out by Thursday. And so I think one of the things that we have to look at, it can be introduced in the Senate tomorrow and be in committee on Wednesday and on the floor in the Senate on Wednesday afternoon or on Thursday morning. And if, passage, and then it can be subbed. Either house can sub the other bill, but it has to be an identical, we have to make certain that it's an identical bill. So. Any other questions? All right. Thank you guys for your time. I always appreciate you.